First, my congratulations to the audience, for those of you who are still with us. Well done. Reminds me of teaching class at West Point after lunch, sort of like filming the movie Coma. You're much more animated. In the run-up to World War I, shortly before its outbreak, Russia celebrated 300 years of rule by the Romanov dynasty. Lenin was hopelessly depressed and actually contemplated suicide, and he's documented that. Within the space of only 2 or 3 years later, suddenly everything changed. And Lenin wrote in his journal, things that previously took decades or centuries are now happening in the space of weeks and days. Ladies and gentlemen, Lenin is my inspiration. That's why I'm here today, because I think we are on the threshold of profound change. Not all positive, not all necessarily negative, but change, social, political, and economic, over the next several years in an environment of constrained budgets and fiscal austerity, as well as domestic discontent, that will create an opportunity over the next 5 years or so to make profound change inside America's military establishment, to essentially perform surgery that is decades overdue, I would argue. And so what I'm going to cover very briefly in the next few slides are excerpts from a longer brief that's 15 slides. And this is available to you. I'm sure that the Project for Defense Alternatives can give it to you. I'll be happy to give it to you. It's designed for Secretary Hagel because my goal is very simple. First of all, I want us to maintain capable forces in being that, if required to fight, can do so successfully, can be successful with a minimum of casualties in a future conflict or crisis that we may not necessarily want, but nevertheless could happen. The question is, how many people do we maintain, and what capabilities do we want? And that's part of the surgery that is now required. And as you can see from this first slide, the critical step in the surgery is truly to revise our strategic view of the world. Now, the first thing I would tell you is there is no national military strategy. We haven't had a national military strategy of any kind since 1989. What you have published every year is a series of platitudes exhorting us to export goodness, love, prosperity, humanity, a readiness to be the quote-unquote global force for good everywhere, creating the illusion that wherever we go, whatever we do, we wear the white hats, and that we are desperately needed everywhere, and most important, that everywhere we go, we are warmly welcomed. I think that 20-plus year period is ending. We can't afford it. The world doesn't want it, and the American people aren't interested. So the first thing is to recognize, what is it then that justifies the maintenance of these military forces? In other words, why do you keep them? Well, you keep them as a strategic hedge against the possibility that you may be drawn into a conflict with a major power or a coalition of powers in a war that you would frankly otherwise choose not to fight. I know that's odd since we've chosen to fight so often, but we lose sight of the fact that since 1991, we haven't fought anyone with an army, with an air force, with air defenses, or with a navy. We're fighting people with AK-47s running through alleys and valleys and calling it war. If you're British, French, Dutch, or Belgian, you call it colonial warfare. We call it nation building, counterinsurgency, and other kinds of things. That is ending. That doesn't mean, however, that we will not fight anyone who can fight back. Gentleman stood up earlier and said, have we evolved to the point where that's no longer going to happen? Well, unfortunately, I would contend absolutely not. That was the widespread feeling, as H.G. Wells recorded before World War I broke out, that a major war between great powers could never occur, that it would never occur. And in fact, he pointed out that one of the reasons it did occur is that no one had experienced a major war for so long, they no longer had an appreciation for how destructive and damaging it could be. And remember, after 1815 until 1914, you had this long period of apparent peace, and the belief was it would continue in perpetuity. We're 70 years, very nearly, beyond the Second World War. That means that sometime over the next 30 years, things are going to change. Now, what is the change that we should look for? What should we worry about militarily? And that's the first bullet. The first bullet is a coalition of powers or a single power that manages to dominate the Eurasian continent. In other words, imagine a situation in which India, China, Russia, part of Europe all band together against us, decide to exclude us from trading with them, of conducting business with them. Today, absolutely impossible. The good news is the world wants to do business with us. We should want to do business with the world. But the point is that's the kind of dangerous development that you maintain a force in being to deal with in the event that it should occur. Will we know when it comes? We probably will, because we'll be able to watch. Well, what about Africa? What about Latin America, South America? South America remains exactly what Henry Kissinger said it was, a dagger pointed at the heart of Antarctica. Africa is a tragic place where people will struggle for centuries trying to emerge from barbarism. Much of Southeast Asia is a little bit better off, but again, completely incapable of presenting any sort of threat to us. So once you leave Northeast Asia, the Middle East, Central Asia, Russia, there isn't much out there that can threaten us, and that's good news. It doesn't mean, however, that in the future those conditions might not change. So you need a force. The second thing is you have to be prepared to deal with that unambiguous threat that manifests itself quite suddenly, a punitive operation. Let us assume that someone acquires biological agents that can be dispersed from UAVs, that this is set up in some country, in North Africa, or even south of the border in Mexico. We have to be prepared to strike decisively to eliminate that threat, if it should occur. Punitive operations are limited, but they're also needed potentially in the future. The rest of it, you maintain the lines of communications that are required, and you defend the Western Hemisphere. It is in our interest that we be the dominant power in the Western Hemisphere, that we maintain the inviolability of our borders and coastal waters. And if you look at the vast array of threats that get so little attention today, biological threats, nuclear threats that can come from terrorism, can come from people who come into the United States who are infected with diseases of which we're unaware, that come, as we've seen thus far, through immigration. Those things are important. We have to defend against them. So that's your basic strategy. At the next level, on the operational level, we have an interest in compressing levels of command and integrating various commands. Ladies and gentlemen, each of your regional unified commands, you have anywhere between 10 and 30 or even 40 single service headquarters. 2-star, 3-star, 4-star headquarters, Air Force, Army, Navy, Marine. And then you have a 4-star who's appointed at the very highest level in the regional unified command, who is supposed to manage this conglomerate of various service headquarters, make it a functioning whole, and then in the event of a crisis or conflict, extract unity of effort from it. It doesn't work very well. It never has. We have to address that because increasingly the multitude of those headquarters are unaffordable as well as unnecessary, redundant, and counterproductive. And then finally at the bottom, what should these forces in being look like? They need to be organized increasingly in modern warfare around what I would call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance, strike, in other words, attack, the ability to attack beyond the line of sight, maneuver, the people that actually go in on the ground and seek positional advantage, and then finally sustainment. Sustainment is very important because it must be increasingly joint in order to economize, and that involves solutions that are not single service. Communications, electronics, software, platforms, you can go down the entire list. We cannot afford the multitude of single service solutions anymore. So which one do I hit here?
This is good, mine.
Anybody up? Oh, there we go, got it. ISR, strike, maneuver, and sustainment. Within the regional unified commands, and we need to reduce the numbers of regional unified commands that we have. We no longer need all of them. We need to integrate these forces across service lines, packaging them along these lines under a single unified command structure. In other words, get rid of those headquarters that I mentioned earlier and then begin to see the services not as this is a Marine operation, this is a naval operation, this is an Army operation, which we've just seen for the last 20 years, but instead see it as a military operation that is inherently integrative in nature, is commanded and controlled joint at the strategic and operational levels, with the services providing the force packages to support those operations. Now, how difficult is that to do? Well, if you look carefully at this slide, you will see right now, today, it's enormously difficult. Look at the numbers of four-star generals that we have on active duty for the Army and the Air Force today.
Wrong slide.
No. Look at the numbers. How many do we have on active duty today? It tells you, gives you the answer up there. For 879,000 troops, we have 29, or is it 23? 23 four-stars, Army and Air Force. Move down to the Navy and Marine Corps, and you've got 10, plus 4 Marine four-stars. What did we have during the Second World War? It's astonishing, ladies and gentlemen. Until March of 1945, from the time we entered the war, we never had more for the Air Force and the Army than 4 four-star generals. And in that combined force, Army and Navy together of almost 15 million men, those 4 stars managed not only to command these forces effectively, but actually to be successful. Today we have 1 admiral for every ship. During World War II, we had 1 admiral for every 130 ships. Obviously, the quality of leadership in the Navy has improved dramatically. So what is to be done? And I give you some points down at the bottom. We need a flag officer review. Then I would argue we need an executive order that begins to downgrade the flag officer positions. And obviously, as you begin to reorganize the command and control inside the armed forces, inside these regional unified commands, you can create new positions and absorb some of the old positions, but clearly there has to be a significant reduction on the service side, single service headquarters of 3 and 4 stars, and in some cases 2 stars. Oops, wrong way. Now, what's this look like? When you get through with this, you end up with a new paradigm, a new warfighting paradigm on the right-hand side of the slide. On the left is your World War II construct. You have a 4-star at the top who is your regional unified commander. Beneath him, he has another 4-star who is the Joint Force Task Force commander. Remember that when we had a 4-star in Tampa during our operations in CENTCOM in Iraq, we also had a 4-star in Iraq. In other words, the 4-star in Tampa could not rely on a 3-star to manage fewer forces than we had in a World War II Corps. We only had about 130,000 men, 140,000 men at the height of the Iraq operation. That's about the size of a World War II Corps. Most of the time we had fewer than that, and we had to have another 4-star in Iraq. We had to have another 4-star in Afghanistan. We have to have 4 stars everywhere. Apparently, if you're not a 4-star, you can make no decisions and accomplish nothing. Apparently, if you have lots of 4 stars, you can still make no decisions and accomplish absolutely nothing. The point is, we don't need it. It has to change. The way to do it is on the right-hand side, where you convert these echelons that currently command all of these unneeded headquarters into a joint force command. And beneath that, you create 1-star force packages. Now, somebody said, well, why do you want 1-star force packages? For the very simple reason that across the force, it's in our interest to reduce the numbers of command levels and gates. And one of those is the full colonel level of command. If you've noticed, most of your general officers, when they finally reach 1 star, look like my grandfather. This is a catastrophe. We need youth, we need imagination, we need energy, and we need it in the General Officer Corps, and it's not there. Increasingly, it's very entropic. And that's why when any political figure stands up and asks anyone in the armed services, Admiral, General, what do you think about these changes that are being proposed? Oh, Senator, Congressman, they're very, very difficult. Very difficult. I can tell you based on my considered military judgment of 35 years, this is hazardous. I would not do it. Okay. Those guys need to go away. And nothing Nothing is going to change until they do. They cannot reform themselves. Now, to go back to something Gordon Adams said earlier, he talked about drawdowns. And he talked about having done these things successfully. Well, your measure of success varies quite a bit. I watched the 1991-1992 drawdown. And I remember when I returned from the Gulf War, and they had to make a decision at the top of the Army about eliminating additional spaces. We had gone down to about 700,000. We had to go down ultimately to 495,000. And one of the quick decisions that had to be made was, where do we harvest 4,400 spaces? Where do we get them so that we can cut them out of the force? Well, there were 4,400 spaces in U.S. Army Europe headquarters. There were 40 generals. The rest were strap hangers and courtiers there designed to support the various generals. And of course, the man in charge was a 4-star with a 3-star deputy and multiple 2-stars in critical positions. So we decided in an act of great courage to disband 4,400 men in a combat unit, sending all the soldiers into civilian life who had just come back and had combat experience and had performed brilliantly, so that we could keep the 4-star headquarters, all the generals, and the strap hangers. Ladies and gentlemen, if all we do is run an accounting exercise and leave the decision up to the admirals and the generals, what will be cut, what will be kept, you are not going to end up with a viable force over the next 5 to 10 years. You will not end up with a force that can fight. You will not end up with a force that will cultivate new capabilities for the future. You will end up with something very much like what you have today, smaller, less capable, with lots of admirals and generals in headquarters and very, very few people who can deploy and fight. So that's my pitch, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.